emotions about, okay, I think I have to press continue there. But I was struggling so much with my own feelings about how do I deal with my knowledge about what's happening in the world. And I started to realize I couldn't be the only one feeling like this. And, you know, you talk about being validated. I wondered where the other people were, you know, that were feeling the same way as me, which is what started me on this journey to go and ask people how to deal with our emotions around climate change. And of course, early on, I realized that it could all be encapsulated with this one beautiful phrase, which is climate grief. So, oh, and the other thing I should say about why I ended up writing a book is that when I was going through this, there are a lot of books about facts already out there, Blanche. You know, and a lot of them are written by men, and that's not to say there's a gender bias to this, but we do process emotions differently on average. And so I wanted a book that was narrative and that would connect with me emotionally, and tell a story rather than just give me a series of chapters and facts, because I'd seen so much of that. But what actually started this for me, I had no intention of writing about it, but I'm very grateful that I did and get a chance to then come and share what I learned. But basically, I have this love for snow. And I fell in love with snow when I was extremely young. And I want to read you to begin with, from the first chapter in the book, because this is what actually leads ultimately to this journey of grief that I went on. So each chapter is a different emotion, by the way. I've always wondered why I fell for snow, because I grew up on a beach on the edge of a desert, about as far from snow as you can get. Perth, Western Australia, 3,000 kilometres from the nearest mountains. Frankly, 3,000 kilometres from just about anywhere. So you'd think I'd be a beach babe, and I was. But as a little girl gazing at the white sand and clear blue water of Cottesloe Beach, somehow it was another white landscape that captured my imagination. A land of dramatic peaks and frosted statues, of sleigh bells and dragons and high-stakes adventures, and the ever-present possibility of magic. My mind was being captured by snow. So I fell in love with the notion of snow before I ever met it, to put it in those sort of human terms. And all our fairy stories are full of snow. I mean, it's not surprising that we can feel this affinity with this beautiful landscape, because it's captured our imagination for millennia. I actually have Norwegian ancestry, so I probably heard even more of these snow stories. You know, you go through a cupboard and you're in Narnia. You know, Lord of the Rings, based on Norse myth, blew my tiny pre-adolescent mind. And the majesty of the landscape, the mountains, is of course as much part of that story as the characters in it. And it tells you so much about, you don't have to be, you know, have a continuous connection to country to feel this urge to connect with a place. Our entire imaginative and creative world is suffused with it. Anyway, I grew up, I moved east and became a reporter for Catalyst, and I got to fall in love with a real snow place. And as I've learnt to call it, it's Kunama Namaji, the snowy mountains. And so there I was at Catalyst being a science reporter during the week, and on the weekends in winter, I would get all excited and I'd jump in my Prius and I'd drive down to the snow, and I'd be in my magical place. And it was like rediscovering a fantasy world. It's full of unique creatures. It's every bit as precious and unique in Australia as the Great Barrier Reef is, these beautiful snowscapes we have here. You know, you've got incredible creatures like wombats go and make the little burrows, their snow caves in the snow. You have echidnas that hibernate and actually waddle across the slopes when they come out in spring. You've got the pygmy possum that sits in this subnivean space where the insulating snow keeps it warm during winter, and that's how it survives. That's the highest living mammal in Australia, and it also hibernates. And then, of course, you've got the snow gums, which they're incredible. They twist and turn in these bonsai shapes, and the trunks are jewel colors of red and gold and silver, and then they branch out into these leaves that are covered in ice and glitter in the sun like chandeliers. So you can feel the love just in my descriptions of it. But they were separate, this fantasy place and the real world of science reporting and logic. And, I thought I knew a thing or two about climate change. Of course I did, but I knew it intellectually. Didn't know it here. And so it was 2017, so not that long ago. I was actually in Japan. I'd just finished with Catalyst, in fact, and I'd never been there. And so, I was having a great time. I was skiing powder for the first time, and I was hanging out with ski instructors on holidays. And then I just had this moment where I went, hang on, what's a Swiss ski instructor doing here on holidays? It's January, his busiest time of the year. So I asked him, and he said, I came to find good snow. So it hadn't snowed that Christmas in Switzerland. And later that week, half the Great Barrier Reef died. And I looked around at my magical kingdom and I thought, oh my Lord, I hadn't really thought about the implications for the places I love. And when I got back to Australia, I couldn't concentrate on normal science stories anymore. I'm a bit like that still, actually. And so I spent a year researching what was going to happen to snow, and I was going to try and make a film about it to make people aware of it. That didn't happen. But by the end of all that process, I'd hit this personal tipping point where the intellectual knowledge of climate change had switched into this deeply emotional knowledge. And I fell apart for a while. I was just crying all the time, and it got so bad. I went to my doctor, and for the first time in my life, actually asked for antidepressants. And that's not the end of the story. That's actually the beginning.
What an incredible way to start. And I just loved hearing your descriptions of snow, and it really gave me an awareness of thinking about snow in a way that I never had. And also just your love of snow and that being your magical place made me really think about what my magical place is. And it just increased that sense of appreciation. Like this morning I went down to Clovelly and I was swimming and I saw the blue groper, and I'm like, this is one, if not there's many, but the ocean does it for me. And I think for a lot of Australians, it's the beach that really helps them to feel alive. So to really hear from you about snow, and it's only just increased that lens of awareness I have for these places of beauty, which you've referred to as heart places. Could you tell us a bit more about that, please?
Absolutely. It's a term that I've come up with to describe this because, I'm sharing my love for snow, but I want you to think about your own heart places and what they mean to you, that sense of that mix of magic and living and reality all combined into one. But the way it makes you feel is alive. I'm not a particularly spiritual person, but that's my spirituality comes in when I'm in these heart places. So I coined the term because that's how it feels to me. You fall in love with places in the same way that you fall in love with people. And as a science reporter, I've become fascinated by that, because if you actually ask people at a dinner party, for example, or, people you just meet on any time, where are your heart places? People actually really think, and they'll go, this farm or this beach I go to, or my park that I go to, or your beach, Clovelly, and we all have different ones, just like we love different people. But at the basis of it, from a neurobiological point of view, which I've looked into a bit, what we're talking about is that evolution has actually gifted us with these emotional tendencies to fall in love with places just as we do with people. And the reason is the same. I suspect the neurobiology is the same. I mean, when I describe going down to the snow, or even where I am now, and since COVID, I've actually moved to my other heart place, because you have more than one, but you don't have many, in Jiroa, I feel almost giddy, like I'm going to see a loved one, and so I think the neurobiology is probably even similar, dopamine, noradrenaline, oxytocin, all these bonding chemicals that give you that feeling of love. And so why did evolution give us this love or tendency to fall in love with places and people? Well, it's to cleave us, it's to weld us to those places and people. And more than that, to make us do whatever we can to protect what we love, the people we love, and the places that we love. And if and when we can't protect them, what are we going to feel? We're going to feel grief. So all these things are tied up. And yeah, this is the notion of heart places that I've come up with, but it does describe a deep biological tendency in it. And just to clarify it even more, if you think about it from an evolutionary point of view, mate selection was super important. Looking after your family was super important, but so was habitat selection and looking after the place that protects and sustains you. In other words, our survival as a species was dependent on it.
Mm. Speaking about the heart and how important those connections are, very early on you include something that's very deeply personal to you, where the love of your life, Robin Williams, was, he literally died in front of you. What an event that would have created so many emotions, but yet it's in a book about climate grief. Why did you include that?
Exactly. And just to clarify, it has a happy ending. In fact, he's sitting outside, so he doesn't actually walk in the back of my Zoom. But this happened all around about the same time. So it was, my brain eventually put these things together. But he had cancer. And when you get a partner's diagnosis with cancer, it actually changes your relationship with how you see them, because most of the time we never really think that we could die, or our parent or our partners or someone we love could die. And then something like a bad cancer diagnosis happens, and all of a sudden you're forced to confront, well, how do I go forward from here? My partner or myself or, are under deep threat. And then, on his second round of chemo, I was home here actually. It happened just here. I haven't done a Zoom where it was just here. I heard him drop. I was outside. Well, I didn't know I heard a thump, and I came inside, and there on the floor was my partner, and he was white, like I've never seen a human white, and he wasn't breathing, and he was just doing this agonal breathing, and I was running to his side, and I was trying to find a pulse, couldn't find a pulse anywhere. Knew he wasn't breathing. I was pretty sure his heart had stopped. And, minutes go by, I think a couple of minutes, and I don't know how to do CPR, but you're confronted with that question, what would you do to save the one you love? And so after about 3 minutes, I'm thinking, I can't wait any longer. No one's coming to rescue us. I've got to try something. And so I just started pumping. 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And on 6, this pink line went all the way up his body, and he woke up and he said, "Why are you crying?" And I was like, "Give me a minute." I was thinking, God, this is the first time I've told that story where I'm sitting right next to where it happened. Jesus. Anyway, so later on, when I was trying to confront my feelings about snow and the reality that from the research that I'd done, I could tell that the chances of snow surviving in Australia were very low unless we really changed our trajectory on our business as usual carbon emissions. And in my lifetime, we're talking. That feeling was really similar to how you deal with emotionally with a partner with a bad diagnosis. But the thing is, you do what you can, like you act, you don't just go into denial, right? You don't look away and go, oh yeah, it's not happening, it's not happening. You do whatever you can. But at the same time, you don't stop living. if anything, life becomes more precious. And, I value, while he's sitting outside listening, I value that man all the more and appreciate my time with him because I know that it could be taken away. So I think it's a really clarifying analogy with how you feel about your heart places if they're under threat, is to think about your love for them, and that be a better motivator for how you act on their behalf long term than fear, because fear is designed to spike and drop, and that's what evolution did it for. But if you sit with fear all the time, that's anxiety, and it basically poisons you with an overdose of corticosteroids and all those things. And that's where you do end up with that long-term just malaise. And that's part of the journey of the book, how to find your way through the grief and not just be stuck in a constant state of anxiety, anger, denial, all those stages of grief, basically.
Yeah, you talk a lot about courage
Yeah.
as being one of the key ingredients.
Okay, I have to get rid of that. Are you back? Sorry. Yeah, I don't actually know how to disconnect my phone from this. So
I'm in the
apologies for
same
that.
boat if anyone calls
Yeah.
me.
It's all right. It went away very quickly.
Mm-hmm.
Courage, yeah. So what actually happened with writing the book? I've told you some really formative things that happened prior, but I just woke up one day in 2019 and went, oh, hell, I need to write a book. I never expected to be sharing the private stories I've just told you. They were just experiences of mine and that I was trying to deal with, as we often do, deal with stuff, in our own little milieu of our friends or just ourselves. But I started talking to people who were starting to say the same kind of things. This was early 2019. And yeah, I woke up and went, oh, wow, well, actually, I am a science reporter. I could, go and ask other experts. I could ask other people how you deal with this and how you get through it. I'd obviously come up with some of my own strategies. One of them, by the way, was running away and healing myself with nature for 3 months in the snow, rather than taking those antidepressants. Another was, that love analogy, but there must be more out there. So yeah, I started the journey of writing and researching the book in October 2019. And a very interesting time to start any project, really. That ended up being the summer everything changed. But the very first thing that caught my attention was that I'd been having this trouble with the notion of hope. Because I don't know about you guys listening, but have you ever had your hopes dashed about action on climate? Because I can tell you I've had that happen repeatedly. And, I looked to Glasgow with a mix of sort of hope, but also, what's the word? Courage. It's like, if it doesn't go exactly as I hope, I'm not going to let myself be destroyed by that, because that has happened to me in the past. I felt absolutely devastated when my hopes have been dashed. So how do I deal with this problem I was having with hope? And I heard this podcast by a woman called Anna Rose, and she's an amazing change agent. And she said this thing. She started talking about courage. And she started talking about how the very derivation of the word, it's cœur, French, cœur, meaning heart, and rage, meaning anger or fight. Put that together, courage, courage. It's basically the anger to fight for what you love. And it was like a light bulb. And I thought, of course, courage, old-fashioned word, although in the last 2 years, I think that word has had such a revival because it's the right word when times are tough. But it's the word we always fall back on when times are tough. When your partner gets diagnosed with cancer, or my grandparents were in the war, World War II, not knowing if they would survive or not, and they had it's pretty unlikely that they did survive, but they did. What would you say when hope isn't useful? you say courage.
Mm.
It's a word you can whisper to yourself. So, and of course, you always bring your hope back, but courage is there and it's stronger. And as the other thing Anna said is that, you know, courage is a decision. And also there's an action involved in it. You know, that anger to fight for what you love. So even if that action is just, you know, let's say you're stuck in it, oh God, worst case, you know, a camp. How do you keep going, and how do you keep your loved ones going? Courage. And it's very encouraging, you know, just even saying the word is incredibly encouraging. So yes, I love courage and I use it often. I even say it to myself. Yeah.
There's so many encouraging, inspirational stories of individuals, as well as going through all those difficult emotions. You're kind of coming up with various examples and strategies as well of people you're speaking to. Among those were these amazing kids in Castlemaine. And just, you know, last week there was a discussion as part of the Eco Living Festival around the film I Am Greta. And I know those kids have got something to do with the Greta story. So it'd probably be a great time to share some of that.
Yeah, so my original idea for the book and the journey, I mean, they're the same thing. Me going on this journey of, well, how the hell do I deal with this climate grief, and the book, that basically I ended up turning it into a diary because, you know, writing something like this over what turned out to be the Black Summer fires and then COVID, you know, what an extraordinary time in history. So my original idea of just going out and asking different people for advice still happened, but it became this much bigger narrative about actually dealing with all the fundamental shifts in our understanding of the world that have happened over the last 2 years. I'm sure all of you can relate to feeling completely disorientated at times, even feeling like you've fallen into the plot of a film, right? You know, you're seeing things that look like something out of a disaster film, or then next minute you're in the film called Plague. You know, it's been a rush of where you know, this life that we had, all of a sudden now we feel like we're living a fiction, but of course it's our real lives and we have to adjust to it. So early on, again, before things got really pear-shaped, I met with these Castlemaine kids. So I wanted to talk to some of the climate kids in Australia because I knew they'd be inspirational and I knew that they'd have something to teach me and just have fantastic stories to tell. And I am a storyteller. And so I'd heard about the Castlemaine kids. This is a little town in Victoria near Melbourne. And I knew that they'd started the Australian school strikes. So that's all I knew. And then I contacted them. I finally got onto them. I did this mad dash down to Melbourne just for 3 days. And I didn't even know that I was going to get in touch with them, but I managed to get their phone numbers right at the last minute, or their parents, because they're all young. And the plan ended up being I would go to Castlemaine, actually stay with them the night and just chat to the kids while they had dinner, because that's just what happened. So here I was thinking, okay, well, I'm going to meet these kids and they'll tell me about starting the school strikes. I had no idea what their significance had been into the world. So these three kids, like a 12-year-old and a 13-year-old, 11, anyway, young, basically they saw a newspaper clipping about Greta and they were friends and they went, well, why don't we have a little school strike? We could do something like that. What a good idea. And we could get 10 of us, 10 of us in our classroom. So they went and did that. And then they met up with this person who was an adult who listened to them and they said, and she said, oh no, I think you could do this a bit bigger. We could make this really big. You've got all the enthusiasm. We could have like a rally in Melbourne and see if we could get some kids to turn up to that. And don't just do it next week like you wanted to. Why don't we wait a month and then we can drum up a few more people? And because you need some help with social media, kids, because it turned out none of these kids even had a phone. They were Steiner kids. And so they didn't know anything about social media. Anyway, so that's what happened. They actually got in touch with Greta and spoke to her. And this thing just started snowballing, but they didn't even know because they're on social media. So they end up going to Melbourne expecting to see maybe 200 kids if they were lucky. 5,000 kids just in Melbourne. I think it was 20,000 around Australia, or 15,000. I've forgotten the exact figures. But those were the pictures that went around the world, you see, because it was the Australian school strike doing this thing, being successful, being in Europe, but it had kind of potted along and hit this level. And then along came this vision of 15 to 20,000 kids all across Australia with their placards and their slogans, often funny slogans. And that set the whole world on fire. That was if Greta lit the match and got, a fire started, these kids turned it into a bonfire. And I just wanted Australians to know about this story, because we need to understand our own role. These 3 individual kids, they're the ones that basically made the whole thing take off worldwide. I call it 1 plus 3. 1 plus 3 makes 7 million. So Greta got started, and she obviously had, 1,000 or so supporters by that stage. Then 3 kids from Castlemaine, they turned it into a bonfire, and a year later, 7 million people went on the climate strike.
It's really great to hear these inspirational stories, and I guess later we can talk about our news diet. But before we get to that, and how we select what we look at. But before we get to that, one of the other things that I love that you've really included is a focus on creative people. So music features, and then there's this great humor throughout the book as well. You've even interviewed so many great people like Missy Higgins and Craig Rucastle. Why did you go for them?
Yeah, look, I know I'm a science reporter and known for that, but I was interested in all of us. And so I didn't want it to be a science book, although science is in it. It's a book about emotions and how we feel. And look, I'm great admirers of Missy Higgins and of Charlie and others. And also they spoke to some of the emotions that I wanted to include in the book. So let's go Missy first. So let's talk about music. So, and this is the chapter called creativity. Okay, maybe technically that's not an emotion, but it's a state that we have. And I think creativity is so important. It's how we share, it's how we process grief, it's how we bond, it's how we inspire, it's everything really. And it's innovation, the innovation that we'll need to go forward into our climate altered world. I didn't know that Missy Higgins, who I'd been a fan of for years, had also had a climate grief collapse, if you want to call it that, as profound as mine. And she'd written all these songs as a result that I listened to. It's on an album that she then called Solastalgia, which is, many of you may have heard that term. It's philosopher Glenn Albrecht invented it to talk about the sadness we feel about a heart place that's still there, but really distressingly altered. So she wrote these songs on this album, and they just, oh God, I couldn't stop weeping when I first heard them because of the words as well. Of course, she's a beautiful music writer. I think these are some of her best songs. And so I went to see her, and yeah, she was just so soulful. And she said this beautiful thing about creativity or about music, that it's a way of taking all the pain and confusion inside and distilling it into something beautiful, or transforming it into something beautiful for all of us to share. And in that, we don't feel so alone.
There was that beautiful connecting space, just while we're still on music, in one of your chapters, where you went to hear a rock band, and they were playing their rock and roll, and then they broke out into Amazing Grace. Is that something you can just tap into?
You're the first person to ask me about that scene, so I'll try not to get emotional, because of course all this really happened. So this was, what was it, late January, I think. And so the fires had been going on for a long time. I'm in the South Coast, and as we'll hear, a lot of my loved ones were in the path of the fire. So it became, this abstract became more and more real as even the couple of months of me, a few months of me writing this book went on. And so the blues festival in the mountains, the snowy mountains, and I should mention that a lot of people who live in the snowy mountains also have connections to other areas of the South Coast. So I knew that if we were all gathering there, there'd be people who'd lost their homes, there would be people who'd been fighting fires. Some of my friends had been fighting fires. Obviously, one of the ski resorts had already burnt down by that stage. Jindabyne had been under threat. Anyway, so we're all at this music festival, and yeah, we went to dance to this band that's a really rocking band, and it was actually raining outside. It was just about the first rains we had, and so that was a celebration in itself. And all of a sudden they just switched into Amazing Grace, and he didn't mean to. I asked him afterwards, the singer, because he's also from the South Coast, and he said he just started, and he just held out the microphone to the audience, and the audience started singing. And he was he was going to sing again, and then he just went, and then he just held out the microphone again, and the whole bloody hall, particularly the women, just started singing from the back, and it was like hairs on the back of the head, you know. And you know, I'd already done that interview with Macy Higgins by that stage, and so later when I reflected on it, it's like, that's exactly right. So none of us had had any time to grieve what had been happening with the fires. And then all of a sudden there's this release that comes through the music that's so touching. And yeah, I did go and talk to the singer afterwards, and he was a bit speechless too, because it was so unexpected. But it was like he knew, and we all knew, that moment out of nowhere just needed to happen, and music was the conduit.
It's very connecting and brings people together.
Yes, I should add, because when we sing together and play music together, we release oxytocin, and it actually bonds us. So there's a real reason that singing and music and dancing are such a part of weddings, funerals, you know, all those times of important emotional rituals. So yeah, from a deep evolutionary point of view, music actually, it's that creative spirit is actually, we evolved to do this.
And ritual is something you talk about a lot, but I'm just keeping an eye on the time because we've got so much to get through as well. And you mentioned, like, one of the other things, sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off there, but I'm just like, there's just so much and we've got to get there. The humor is another thing that really comes through. I mean, you've mentioned the fires, and we're actually building towards that, just that big time. But
so humor, I wanted to include that in there too, because no one ever talks about humor enough when they're talking about all these dire, you know, prospects. And the fact is, what do we do when the shit really hits the fan? You know, we go out of our way where we can to make each other laugh. And in fact, some of the, and we evolved to do this. So some of the funniest, blackest jokes that I heard over that summer were from the people who'd actually lost their houses. Like, and people don't think to ask this. So I went and hung out with quite a few people who'd lost their homes, and I would ask each of them, so what jokes did you tell about it? And then you can see their faces relax, and they'd light up and they'd tell me. And, you know, stupid jokes, things like, you know, there was a group of people sitting around in Nimboida, which had burnt down, and half of them had homes and half didn't, and it was getting a bit late. And one of them, you know, turns to the others and says, "What are you still doing here? Don't you have homes to go to?" And then, you know, there's other things that the teenagers were saying to each other. Black humor, totally underrated how important it is. And again, we evolved for this, because what does laughing together do? What does it do? Well, obviously it acknowledges and allows you to deal with the emotional processes around some really big stuff. But it does that physically. It actually defrags your physiology. You know, when you're laughing, it reduces your cortisol. It helps us manage all those stress hormones. And it also, like music, it releases oxytocin. And so what it does, let's say in the worst possible circumstances where something terrible has happened and you're sitting around afterwards and someone tells some sort of black joke and someone else says too soon, and, you know, everyone kind of laughs. What you're doing in that moment is obviously helping regulate everyone's anxiety and emotions together, but also the oxytocin. You're bonding everyone there and reminding us that we're not alone.
Do you know, I really appreciated your light touch as well throughout the book. Several times this Chernobyl guy character came up, and you can share a bit about who that is, but I had in my head who Chernobyl guy was and is, and it actually was, it lifted something when we were talking about a deep topic of denial.
Yeah. So I always wanted to put a chapter on denial in because I'd done stuff with Catalyst about disasters and why, and consulted with specialist psychiatrists who specialize in disasters and its aftermath. Why do we never think disaster is going to happen to us? Which is, you know, related to denial. And so when I called Professor Sandy McFarlane, who was the main person I already knew, I'd known him for a few years, but I knew that I was going to interview about this deep-seated problem of denial with us, that we never think disaster is going to happen to us. Anyway, I rang him and he said, have you seen this? You seen the film Chernobyl yet? You know, the TV series? And I said, no, not yet. He said, watch the first episode, then come back and we'll talk about denial. So for those of you that have seen it, in the very first episode, the nuclear reactor blows up at Chernobyl. And there's a guy, a manager in the control room who just won't accept that this has happened. Like, he can even see there is nothing, there's a column of light going up into the air, you know, that there's the reactor is gone, and he keeps sending people in to be, you know, in to check and fix the rods or whatever that have all gone, because his brain cannot accept even what his eyes literally are telling him, let alone what other people are telling him. He's just in complete denial. So I ended up calling him Chernobyl guy, right, for shorthand. And so it became this shorthand for, we're all Chernobyl guy at different times. Of course we are, because we evolved to have a degree of denial. This is basically why we never think disaster is going to happen to us. Because if we actually woke up every day and thought, I might die today, you know, back to that thing of Robin not thinking he could die, I might die today, we would have never got out of the cave. So our consciousness, when we evolved consciousness, had to evolve this kind of shortcut for putting that knowledge aside. And so we have this optimism bias. We think everything's going to continue as it is, but it does us great disservice when the threat is real. So when you have the threat of a disaster coming, like a fire or a hurricane, a lot of people are really late to leave because they were all doing their Chernobyl guy thing. But at some point, your brain has to flip and actually accept that the disaster is here, and that you need to change plans. Basically, when that brain flip happens, it means you need to stop what you were doing and change plans. Or modify your plan. And of course, you know, as the fires were going off, we had a prime minister in Hawaii.
About that, I was like, oh, I say to Hawaii.
What are you doing? And then it finally hit me. Oh, in this fire, you're Chernobyl guy. You can't see that the reactor's blown up yet. So I used it as a kind of shorthand for any of us can be Chernobyl guy, but in this case, it was trying to understand why some of the commentators and leaders were just not seeming to realize what the rest of us were, that this was not fires as usual. This was a changed landscape, and the plan needed to change. We needed new leadership at that time, and that black brain did flip eventually, but by the time it did, so many of us were already, you know, cranky.
Well, you couldn't deny those fires, and you can't deny those changes that are happening, our climate change. You had your mothers in Malakuta and friends. So
Yeah.
I'd love to hear you read a little bit from that
Yeah.
section of the book, because it really builds to this gripping, undeniable crescendo that you just, it's
Yeah.
still staying with
And
me.
of course, in some ways, all these stories are metaphors for how we deal with this vast overwhelm of the knowledge of a changing, warming climate. So, what happened was that my own denial that disaster can never happen to us came and bit me on the bum, ironically, because it didn't occur to me that we would actually be, or any of my loved ones would be, in the path of the fire. But of course, half the people I know are on the south coast, and my mum lives in Malakuta. So after the Malakuta New Year's Eve, like a prophecy, wasn't it? It's like, welcome to the 2020s. Life is going to be different going forward. Uh, to have that happen on New Year's Eve, that 6 towns got overwhelmed by a monster fire like none we've seen before on that scale. Extraordinary.
You were saying
I went
welcome to
into
2020, weren't you, instead of Happy New Year?
Absolutely, and I still say that. When people say, "Oh, well, it's flood," whatever, I go, "Welcome to 2020." We're all going to learn how to be much better, better at disaster preparedness. That's for sure. So, and there's good things about that. I mean, it's not all bad. You just have to sort of shift the way you think about it. But back to Malakuta. So I got in there. It was cut off for weeks. I got in there as soon as I could, which was early February, and I just spoke to Mum's friends about what it was like. I just wanted to know what it was like. We were under ashfall here, but we weren't in the direct path of the fire except once, and then it didn't come here. But so yeah, this is a bit triggering if any of you have actually been in the fires, but this is Nicholas's story. So I interweave about 6 of the stories that I heard from Mum's friends. And so Nicholas was in his 30s, is in his 30s, young kids. He'd decided to stay and defend his house. He'd never fought a fire before. His father-in-law was doing the same. They were at either end of the street, houses on the same street, and they had walkie-talkies. So they were going to stay in touch that way. Very few people opted to stay and defend in Malakuta because they were warned that they would not be protected by anybody, by the fire trucks or anything. The fire trucks basically had to surround the 3 groups of people that were on the beaches and in the hall. So they were literally on their own. It was just a handful of people who decided to do this. And so they have the walkie-talkies, but of course when the fire came, it had the roar of a 747 and the walkie-talkies were useless. So this is where we pick up Nicholas's story. Unexpectedly on his own, fortified with the desire to protect the life he's built, Nicholas enters survival mode, running up and down the street, fighting spot fires with buckets of water, occasionally a hose. At one point, a power line came down on the road out in front of my house and it all started sparking. That's Nicholas. Oh God, my hand is at my mouth. And then everything was blazing behind me, and then everything in front of me was on fire as well. And I just thought, well, I can't go inside the house because all the houses are burning. And then I thought, well, if things get too bad, I'll just zip down to the beach on my bike and I'll kind of hide under the cliff face. That was my genius plan. Good one, I nodded. It worked? Well, not really, he laughs. So I jumped on my bike and then I head to the beach. Like a scene from a movie, he pedals like the wind down a corridor of fire. All the houses ablaze, all the tea trees ablaze, flames flying 4 times their height, fireballs arcing overhead. It was just raging through the air, and I get there and there's a staircase that goes down onto the beach, and that was on fire. And I ditched my bike and then I ran down the burning stairs, but the fire actually came down the cliff face and the beach was on fire, all the tussocks. And I saw them start burning down the beach and heading into town, and I was like, holy shit. And I couldn't go that way and it was burning down the cliff face. So I ran to where the boat ramp is. I got up to the top of my bike. It was burnt to a crisp. And then another front came through, but on the other side, and it went all the way down to the boat ramp. And I was kind of stuck in the middle then, so I had to run through the golf course. My jaw is on the floor as Nicholas describes running from the flames, ending up doing a 2-kilometre high-speed loop around the back of the fire front to the other end of Terra Nova Drive, checking in on his father-in-law, then sprinting back to his end to pick up a bucket where, if anything, conditions were worse. There was fire everywhere, pretty much every fence was on fire, and then the bushes, trees, houses, and then it kind of escalated. Houses would catch on fire, and then the next house would catch on fire. Everything at that time was just chaos, really. Amid this sensory and emotional overload, with 10 houses burning around him, Nicholas's brain encodes a new knowledge, the dreadful keening sound a home makes just before it dies. It starts chuffing like it's burning on the inside. It starts chuffing and you can see it. The windows start to bend and then bam, the windows pop and it just explodes like a freaking bomb. And then just the thought in your head, like the animals, all the trees. Nicholas looks up, grieving. It's like all the things, the beauty this place has to offer is burning in front of you. And it's out of your control, you know? There's nothing really. You're just a person with two buckets. Now, Blanche, the reason I've ended up reading that, I should probably give a pause for a second. I never know who's in the audience. It's hard when I can't see you because for some people that's very upsetting. But the reason that I've ended up reading that when I've been doing my talks is that afterwards, after I'd written it, I hadn't realized what a powerful metaphor it is for all of us when we're dealing with the overwhelm of climate change. Now, obviously, hopefully, most of us won't be dealing with as extreme an issue as Nicholas. But in the end, we're all just a person with two buckets, right? I mean, that's what we bring. That's what all we can bring to this vast thing of climate change. We just turn up with our buckets. And some of us have got bigger buckets than others. If you're Mike Cannon-Brookes or Twiggy Forrest or Matt Keane has been doing a lot within the New South Wales Parliament for the environment and switching us into our renewable future. Some of us are just creatives, or we're just, a mum, a daughter, a husband, and we just bring our own buckets. But that's enough, that's what you do. And if you want to extend the metaphor further, one bucket might be what you do in your personal life, but you can't win everything. I mean, you're not going to become the perfect fossil-free life. So you decide what works for you. And then the other is the things you do as collectively, which actually do have the most impact, the groups you join, the climate strikes you go to, the business that you decide you're going to switch your business to zero carbon, all the things, the way you vote. We turn up with those buckets and that's enough, And there's a quote that a friend of mine pointed out that's at the end of the book in the chapter called Meaning, where I sort of try to bring it all the strands together, from Gandhi. Whatever you do will be insignificant, and yet it is essential that you do it. And again, just such a perfect distilling of it. And part of that is because you don't know what the outcome will be of your action. And, I've mentioned the climate strike kids, the three of them, they ended up setting off this worldwide phenomenon, which has been so pivotal in helping get some, really social acceptance worldwide toward transitioning out of fossil fuels. Nicholas, with his two buckets, he happened to save his house and several other houses besides. So you just don't know what your action will deliver. All you can do is bring your own buckets. So yeah, there's other strategies. I know, I hope many that we're gonna talk afterwards, aren't we? So if people want to stay online, I can go more specifically into answering people's questions and giving more of the strategies, because I noticed that we are stretching the time.
Jonica, thank you. I mean, your bucket in writing this book and in everything else that you contribute, bringing emotion to the scientists, like that notion that's an important thing for anyone dealing with climate, whether you're a scientist, a health worker, a mother, a father, whatever you happen to be. And also, you've just done so much research and interviewed so many great people for this book. we got to the really gripping story of the fire, and we heard some inspiration from what you shared today. You've also shared in the book so many great inspiring stories, even like say with the Great Barrier Reef, where one of your key colleagues is focusing on the 50 reefs that can be most filled. You've mentioned that while Australia's crappest on the list as far as developed countries going to show their weight at the climate summit coming up in Glasgow, actually Australians per capita have the most solar powered roofs. So your book, I'm just paraphrasing a few things in one here because we are coming to the end, but some of the people talk about community and how it brings out the best in people. You've got a whole section on disaster brain and how to frame responses and questions towards people where they focus on when they had agency. So there's so much in this book, and we are at full time now.
Well, I think can I just have another 3, 4, 5 minutes? Just will you all stay with me? I am going to stay online afterwards as well. We've talked about this with Helen, so that I will interact with you guys watching and answer your questions. But I know we started 5 minutes late, so I'd like to take 5 minutes just to summarize and add to yours to key question of what did I learn on this journey, because I've sort of left you with a little bit with the time thing, right in the middle
on the fire. You've left us in the fires, and there's so much.
Get past that. Yeah. We've got to get past that. So let me tell you about some of the big things that I've learned out of doing this book, but then of course the 2 years that we've lived since then and through the pandemic. First one, so important, most people are good. Most people are great. The pro-social emotions, the media tends to focus on the bad things that happens. That is actually what the media is designed to do, but it's bad for our emotional health. But when you look at the pandemic, when you look at people's reactions after and during the fires, yeah, sure, let's say 10 to 20% of us are more on the selfish, sociopathic end of the spectrum. We're all personality bell curves as a population. But 80% of us, let's focus on them. 80% of people are actually overwhelmed by an urge to do the right thing by their community, to help, to actually, to give, to cook a meal for a friend, to get to know the neighbor, to offer to help, to just make a joke when a joke will help, to share and bond and do right by our community. And when the chips are down, those pro-social emotions, and there's research to show this, of gratitude, empathy, compassion, all come to the fore. And one of those that I talk about quite a lot, but I can't go into here, is pride. We think about pride as this negative word, but actually proud, that's something we evolved. We evolved to feel proud, but it only happens for the best in us. So like if your kid graduates school, like that honors, you say, I'm so proud of you, and everybody bursts into tears. That's because your emotion is so strong that they spent 12 years, knuckling down and got through, or 13 years, however long it is, and got through that. But the other times we've felt so proud is our nurses, our doctors, especially in the early days of the pandemic when we saw so many of them dying overseas, in the fires, the RFS, who are just you and me, volunteers. But we get to feel proud of them, or us, when we get together and do right by our community. So that's the first thing. Most people are really good. And I think those emotions, now that we're actually much more aware of disaster, those emotions, and that's the positive, that they're going to carry us forward. And that's why so many of us are also doing what you've called, Blanche, life audits, and looking at what's meaningful for us going forward. There are some strategies that I want to just quickly mention that are really useful in dealing with your climate overwhelm. One is, we've touched on, be careful of your news intake and balance it out with positive stories. So I subscribe now to a number of podcasts and different things, or even newsletters, because they're quicker, that actually tell you all the positive things that are happening in the climate, and particularly in Australia. And so when you hear, someone being a Chernobyl guy, and I don't mean, as I said, that's not a specific person. There's certain people in the Nationals and others. Anyway, then go and have a look at the guys who are doing all the positive things, even at a state, local, and occasionally federal level. So healthy information diet. The biggest thing of all, look for heroes. That's kind of related to that. The biggest thing of all is something I do just want to spend my last minute or two on: active hope. So I talked about hope earlier, and that's sort of passive hope, if you like. But there's another phrase that's been bandied around that was invented by this eco-philosopher, Joanna Macy, called active hope. And this is the thing that's really worked and speaks to me. And you find that a lot of activists and environmentalists and scientists are actually turning to this as an emotional strategy as well. So the idea is that, first of all, you honour your grief for the world. You're allowed to go through a grieving period, as I have, but you don't have to get stuck there. Grief will come back and forth, of course it will, but even just naming it and validating it and calling it grief makes it somehow more manageable, and something also that you understand that other people are sharing. But then you can use that as a positive to say, well, it means I love, it means I'm human, it means I'm engaged with the world. And that grief going forward, she describes it as being a bounce point then into active hope. And the idea of active hope is clues in the name, it's your action. So you have these two ideas in your brain. One is how the world could turn out if it all turns out badly. And one is the best possible future that you can see in the future. So it's a bit analogous to having a partner with cancer. You hold those two ideas in your head. And then you go, right, I'm not in denial. I understand that things may not work out, but my gift of active hope is whatever I contribute, my buckets, to creating that future. And we won't all do the same thing. We can't all do everything. Some of us don't have the means, but we can do our little bit. And then you catch an inspiring vision and you go forward and treat that life going forward as a grand adventure. So I've certainly found that these words and formulations help me when I need courage. Active hope.
Thank you so much, Jonica. And thanks for staying on a bit more. I know Helen wanted just to wrap up with a few words, and then we can stick around. And there's a few questions coming through on the chat as well about wanting recommendations for podcasts, positive newsletters. I don't know if you can post those into the chat for everyone, Jonica, while Helen's wrapping up, or if that's something we do
I'll
later.
give it a go, but if Helen's okay with it, as I said, I'd like to actually stay online afterwards, and then people can actually ask me questions in person too. Yeah. And that way I'm not trying to run across both.
Perfect.
That's perfectly fine, Jonica. What an inspiring talk and conversation. It is, we do sit in with a bit of despair, especially I worked in sustainability for quite a long time, and you go through these emotions all the time, and you think, is anything happening? And then we've got the big climate talks, in a week's time, and there's still deliberations. So it's so timely, our conversation today, and learning about the denial, learning about, but most thing was about the active hope. So, and I just wanted to share before this is our last day of our festival, and we do have some amazing programs. If you do want to get involved, Ceramic Council has our FOGO program, which is our food organics waste program, and permabees and bush care, so you can get out there and garden, or you can go and help out in our landscapes planting trees. And also we've got some amazing sustainability rebates. I'll put those, a link to those in the chat afterwards as well. So thank you everybody for coming. If you do want to stay on, definitely what an opportunity to talk to Jonica, and otherwise I'll just share that slide with you before you go. We'll be sending a survey through on our email as well, and would love some feedback from you. Okay, so I will hand up.
Can I say something? Just
Yes.
something I realised, just to give everyone a bit more hope as well. And, you know, just back to that idea of action, everybody I spoke to said much the same thing, that you do feel better dealing with your emotions when you get a bit active. But in terms of giving everyone hope, what I want to say is that I think we'll look back on 2020 for all its turmoil as being the start of a great big social tipping point, the social tipping point that's been late coming in Australia, but that we really need. And give us 2030. We won't have done everything that we all hope for now, but we will look back on this period as the beginning of the great turning. So I think there's a lot of joy to be had in having that image in your head.
Oh, that's wonderful. Thank you. All right, so I'll hand it back to Blanche and Jonica. So if you want to put their cameras on, and please let us know, let's have a lovely conversation. It's a great opportunity, Sunday afternoon, to talk about how we can get more courage.
Thank you, Helen. So we're in relaxed time now, and we've had some beautiful comments coming through on the chat. And do you know, Jonica, just that idea of action, that, you know, where we can place our attention, I found really helpful to be reminded of. But enough from me. What about anybody who's listening in? If you want to put your cameras on and ask something directly, please go right ahead. Or if you need to go, thanks for tuning in.
Does Helen need to unmute people? Or can they unmute themselves? I'm actually going to start scanning through the chat too. I haven't been able to. So there's a specific question in there. But if other people want to just dive in, but do we need a moderator to unmute everyone?
Probably.
In which case, if we have to do it through the chat,
people can unmute themselves.
Okay.
I'm going to go through the chat and see if there's any. I noticed someone's mentioning the Voices of supporting climate-focused independence. Yeah, absolutely, all for this movement. And I hope those of us that are in districts where the Voices of are active, it's one of our best hopes for changing the political culture federally, that's for sure. Thanks for that comment. Anyone want to jump in?
There was a question there about how many, what does it say here? Let's see. Podcast and newsletter recommendations will be great. That's from Rosanna.
Okay. Newsletter, the one that I actually, I'm trying to get you on gallery view. Here we go. Newsletter, the one that Missy Higgins recommended for me is called Future Crunch. And they're the ones that put out a weekly newsletter, and it's a beautifully curated, they're Australian guys, but it has a really thoughtfully curated, it's just sort of one page on an email, and it's a part about each and then a link through to the article. So basically they might get something from the New York Times or the Atlantic or wherever. And they're big stories. They're not just, you know, oh, this person, you know, did this lovely thing in their neighborhood. It's things like, one that strikes them up. Did you know that, you know, this country has just, will be 100% renewable next year, you know, and it'll have an article on that. Or it'll have one that struck in my mind was in New York. I didn't know about this, but they had this huge mounds of rubbish that no one knew what to do with. And 15 years ago or so, they just covered the rubbish in dirt and planted it. Like they didn't know what to do. And they put a methane farm underneath. This is in New York. They had decades worth of rubbish. And they're about to open it all as a park. It's rewilded itself. And they're harvesting the methane from the decomposing rubbish from underneath. And they've got this huge wild ecosystem park out of this toxic, you know, rubbish that they used to have. So that's the kind of thing, if you want to click through, that you find on Future Crunch. But they have a lot of, yeah, anyway, I love Future Crunch. Sorry, other recommendations. I actually listen to Sarah Wilson's podcast quite a bit. It will depend on your style. There's one called Outrage and Optimism that Christiana Figueres does. I found that sometimes, they're quite long chats. They're an hour and a half. They can be a bit much, but on a long walk or something, they can be good, and they're a good one to tune in on. I'm sure you've got recommendations for each other. I have to confess, I'm not a Twitter user, but I do now get Mike Cannon-Brookes tweets, because he tweets once a day, and he's obviously throwing a lot of money to switching our entire economy across, and he plans to make a lot of money in the process. But what he does tweet negative things, but a lot of things, like things that are going badly, but a lot of what he tweets is really positive, big things that are happening in Australia from the business community, for example. So that's just a handful of things that I look at. Also, interestingly, you may have noticed that the coverage of environment in the Sydney Morning Herald has changed. And when they do have their negative stories, they generally have at least a few really positive stories in there as well. So they've made a strategic decision to try and balance out that information, so that we can not just be given this false feeling that it's all terrible.
There's some great suggestions. I'm just looking at any questions here in the chat. There's one about being an ethical vegan. Is that something that you wanted to have a look at? It's from Marina.
I can't really speak to that because I'm not an ethical vegan. I don't have a large meat consumption, but that is very small, but I can't sort of identify with that. But I think this comes back to the personal bucket. So there's one thing where one of the psychologists, so I consulted a lot of psychologists, and there's a chapter in the middle that's specifically about what you should tell your kids. And I went to 3 different expert psychologists for that, but actually with the advice in there is also appropriate for us. And so I'm sure you've heard this term, but living authentically within your values. And this is where the decisions you make about the personal actions that you take fits, as opposed to the collective things you do, like, be part of the Voices Of campaign or the school strikes or whatever. Look, I think, in 20 years' time, we're going to have a very high proportion of vegans. It's obviously, Marina, something that's been incredibly important to you. I have friends who are vegan. I have friends who aren't. And I think, obviously, the more and more of us that take those kind of steps, the better. And it will just gradually shift. As I said, my meat consumption has dropped. I mean, it was never high, but you get this social spread. You get people who are leaders in that. You obviously are, Marina, and then you actually do drag the rest of the population with you as well. So it's fantastic that you're doing that.
Yeah, can I just add, because I did ask that question. I don't understand how we can separate the whole issue of animal agriculture and how it affects the environment, because aside from the ethical issues, which I question also, because if you love animals, you can't want to harm them. And that's what we're doing on a regular basis. But just environmentally speaking, it's a huge impact, negative impact on the environment. Land clearing, water use, ocean dead zones, bushfires. Most land is used to raise food for animals, not humans. You talked about rewilding. So I just trying to understand the disconnect from people that are very passionate about the environment, yet that issue is completely shut out of the discussion And also just on a personal level, I asked that question because I am personally not only very concerned about environmental issues, like on a daily basis, I do something. But I also have a deep, deep connection to sapient, all what we are doing to animals. That, you talk about despair, but until you are in that world where you see all these, very caring, good people, quote unquote, and still participating in an activity that could really propel us into a sustainable future without it. Like if we just stopped that immediately, rewilded the earth and just grew food for ourselves, we would actually have enough food to feed the world, and we wouldn't have all this devastation of the environment. But obviously, that's a big picture. But I guess the question in terms of your book is that, and I see that you can't really understand it exactly because you're not in that space. But if I, like I walk around on a daily basis, if I go into a restaurant and someone next to me is eating a hamburger or whatever, I don't see it. It's not a hamburger to me. It's an animal that's been, tortured, kept captive, impregnated, and so on and so on, and killed before it wants to be, etc. That's what I see. Now you talk about grief. That's a very hard thing to deal with. And especially when it's your friends that are partaking in it, like I'm sure. So I don't know that you can answer the question, obviously.
I can't answer the question, obviously.
Thank you so much for the share. I think it's great. It's important to hear the different ways, like so many different avenues to approach climate change in a healthy way.
Yeah, and it's noticeable that is shifting. These social movements start slowly and then suddenly are big. You look at anti-slavery, you look at women's rights, you look at gay marriage. What looks like it's getting nowhere is, I don't know if this is any comfort, but it actually, over time it does really shift, and that shift to veganism is absolutely underway. I can't speak to it. I hear what you're saying. Yeah. I mean, one of the troubles emotionally with all this stuff is that we all have a disconnect with something, because we can't actually function in the world, or very few of us can, without doing some things that actually don't fit what's best for the planet. And that is a difficult thing to deal with. And I guess everybody finds their own space there. All I could hope for is that, I suppose what I say for myself is that I'll just be a little bit better at everything every year. And I'm sorry I haven't switched to veganism.
I'll just add one word that you said that was great: courage.
I'll take that.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. There's a few video cameras on if anybody wanted to ask a question.
May I add to that, Marina? I was just like, what you were talking about vegetarianism or veganism. So I was just thinking, like, I feel like it's a lack of deep awareness by a lot of society that for example, a lot of my friends, they also intake meat, and I don't personally intake much meat at all, but for me, and I do know, like, I sense that there's a bit of discomfort with seeing people eating meat, but then for me, it's kind of telling myself that everyone is kind of different, and if I try to influence them on a more forceful way, then it could turn out, not so great. Like you could lose a friendship or something like that. So for me, it's kind of just leading by example for me. So that's like practicing vegetarianism or veganism, and hopefully that will, like, I guess, affect people without kind of forcing them into a diet they don't prefer. Oh, and on that note, I wanted to say thank you, Jonica. Your sharing of the heart place and the grief was very personal, and I kind of resonated with that because where I used to live, I had a very strong connection to that place. And then when I moved, because my family wanted to move, because they thought that because I was approaching HSC, and they thought moving closer to my school would benefit me in that way. But because I was very connected to the land before, then I felt a lot of grief. And so I feel like I've kind of come out of that now, but also because I've moved back to the similar area. So I feel like I have an affinity with this place. So yeah, but I wanted to ask, like, in terms of being more eco-friendly and environmentally friendly, how can we kind of like try to make an impact on the world without kind of being labeled as, like a radical eco-friendly person or something like that?
It's interesting. I think people have to be a bit accepting that, as I said, none of us can win at the game of being perfect without fossil fuels. It might be what we eat, it might be what we drive, the way we get around. The fact that fossil fuels are embedded in our whole society. There's actually an argument that I agree with, that there's been a push by commercial interests to make us all feel personally guilty for our own lives, and if only we could be perfect, that the world would fix itself, and then it puts all the guilt on us. And that's actually been a deliberate strategy, and it also makes everyone fight each other. It's like, well, you're not doing it as well as me, and you're not doing it as well as me, and you're doing better. It's a deliberate tactic to actually make people feel isolated and like a failure. So that was just one point I wanted to make. Sorry, I just need to get remind me the last part of your question, because it was a really important point about.
So how?
Yeah, go on.
Oh no, do you remember? So it was just how we can kind of try to make it
without being an eco, without
being labelled as such.
Yeah. Well, in fact, so two things. First is Rebecca Huntley has written a great book about how to communicate on climate change, and basically you've got to meet people where they are. Otherwise, you are going to alienate them, because if you don't empathize with their perspective, see where they're coming from, see where you have common ground, it can be very hard to be a persuader within your own group. And so I highly recommend that book. The other thing that I think is true, and I sort of mentioned a little bit in the book, but we've got to be realistic that we actually all have our own tribes, and that's fine. The way we dress, the way we present ourselves, the way we speak, all these things, without us knowing, actually do kind of signal what tribe we are anyway. So if you want to be an eco-warrior feminist, that's great. You'll be out there fighting the good fight and hanging out with your friends. The business people, like my dad, they won't listen to me because I don't look like them. So to a degree, you got to just accept that you're not going to have a huge impact on the groups that are not that are a long way removed from your own values and so on. And when you do meet those groups, which for most of us is actually in our personal lives, our parents, our friends and whatever, that's when you have a chance to connect and actually persuade. And I can speak from personal experience because my father is this is going to be recorded, isn't it? But he would say himself, he is a very conservative voting. He didn't believe in climate change for a long time. And then when he did, he didn't believe that it had the urgency. But he's gradually shifted along. And so have a lot of his contemporaries are now at the forefront of doing a lot of the really big things, like I mentioned, Mike Cameron Brooks, who are actually going to transform society. So have some encouragement, Faith, that there are other tribes other than your own as well that are out there. I sort of have this image, if you think of Game of Thrones when everyone turned up to fight the White Walkers. I don't know, did you see that? But yeah, they all look different, but they all brought their own tribes to the same common goal, right? And so I feel like that's what's happening with the climate space, is that we may mostly be surrounded by the people who are a bit more like us, because we're much more likely to, get activated if we're enjoying the company of the people we're with. But we're all bringing our different, differently dressed, different superpowers of our different tribes, all coming forward for climate action. And for example, one of the groups that, obviously the Youth Coalition for Climate, there's Vets for Climate Action now, there's Doctors for Climate Action now, there's the Voices of group. There's all these different tribes are actually bringing their own groups together and finding out what their unique contribution can be, but all for the same ultimate goal. Parents for Climate Action they're huge, they're fantastic, really effective organisation. And, their Solar Schools program has practical, tangible, and, they're vote winners for the politicians who go ahead with it. And that's one of the organisation that really tries to cross tribes because it's all parents. So, finding these other ways of uniting groups. And so don't worry too much about trying to influence people who are never going to listen to you. Concentrate on where it makes you feel good and where it actually works. Other people are doing that job with that group. You know what I mean? There's other people being you for them.
Yeah. Thank you.
That's really powerful, isn't it? Just sort of thinking where you're going to have the most influence and also following your joy.
Yeah.
And one of the things that I liked in your book, there's this group about saving our winters. What was it called?
Yeah, Protect Our Winters. Yeah.
Yeah, POW.
POW. So they're like this bloody superpower organisation. And even the lead guy, seriously, he looks like he could be cast of Game of Thrones. It's hilarious. I actually met with him in America. I paid for myself to do a trip while I was trying to research this snow thing, and it just struck me how talk about bringing your tribe. He literally looked like a sort of young warrior out of a movie, and he's actually a world-class snowboarder. And he invented this organization a few years ago called Protect Our Winters. So POW, it actually sounds like a superhero organization, but it's huge, and it's been one of the most effective lobbying groups in America, whereas, the debate there has been very toxic in many places. And so what he's done, this organisation has done, is tried to bring out the outdoor industry, because of course snow is threatened everywhere. And the outdoor industry is massive. So they've got clothing companies and sports companies and outdoor industry. And so, getting the corporate all on board, getting the ski resorts all on board, getting the actual snow sports stars, and then they all go and talk to the politicians in Washington and a state level and everything. So it's this one guy with a dream, a snowboarder, has created with his passion this big, very effective organisation and change agency that hits many, many tribes, but the common theme is, well, we love our outdoor activities.
I love that idea of finding your tribe. It just makes it more doable, and it keeps coming back to what we can do
Too
together.
hard otherwise. Yeah. I mean, if it's not fun, if you can't joke around and have some fun, you know, at times, yeah, of course, I'm still going to cry heaps. I could cry practically at the beginning of this talk. No one's perfect. But yeah, just, you know, doing things with people you like, that's all contributing to all these tribes doing what they can. It's like the bringing your buckets analogy. If you try to beat your head against the thing you're not going to have any impact on, that's just the route to despair. And believe me, you know, that's one of the things I was trying to work through for myself, even if it was just my hopes for who might get elected, you know.
Yeah, I think that's so true, because even when within your tribe, like there's people who, like, we all change sometimes. So sometimes we can be more like aware of this particular issue, sometimes we're less aware. So when we do interact with people within the similar tribe, we can still make an impact, because like we're continuing our journey on this,
Yeah,
being eco-friendly. Yeah.
and Joanna Macy said, you know, treat it as an adventure. And, you know, I do fall back on that from time to time, because I loved Lord of the Rings. And you know, what is it? Band of, well, in that case, because it was sexism times, it was Band of Brothers. But, you know, your band, well, you're off on your adventure, especially, you know, you're one of the younger in the group. And so particularly for the younger people, you know, you've got a long adventure. You've got a longer adventure than me ahead. It's one way of thinking about it that completely reframes this kind of, oh, I'm all, you know, I'm scared of how the world's going to change. Well, yeah, we all are that, and we'd be dumb not to have those moments of fear. But what's another way of looking at an unknown future, an uncertain future? Well, it's the beginning of every quest film or story you've ever read or watched. And what always happens on quests, isn't it, that you get, you know, things happen, you get tested, but a lot of the positives of humanity, or Hobbiton come through. Look at Frodo. I mean, Tolkien, and I do talk about this in the book, Tolkien deliberately cast the smallest, least powerful character in the whole of Middle-earth to be the hero that goes through. And why did he do that? And he gets helped by all these other people. This is this tribe, this band of brothers. And why did Tolkien write it like that? But because he was processing his own trauma of 2 world wars. And so, you know, talk about creativity coming out of difficult times. You know, that whole beautiful Lord of the Rings, which is you know, the ultimate story of people trying to save our beautiful planet. You know, it's completely analogous to the way a lot of us feel now. It was his way of processing the darkest of times that he'd just been through, which is 2 world wars. And, you know, in some ways it's like, well, what would Frodo do about climate change? And, you know, Frodo's Greta, right? That's Greta.
Thank you. How's everyone going?
Or shall we finish up there?
We could finish up, but we've got one of our Randwick counsellors in on this call. Kathy, hello. Did you want to ask anything or share anything from the council?
Not from the council, but just from a personal point of view, because I have daughters and I have 2 grandsons, and so I always like to be able, and I must say my daughters and my grandsons and both their husbands are also really very aware, very conscious of very things, very thoughtful. But in particular with my grandsons, I don't want them to become too anxious, because they are already aware. They live in the US, which is unfortunate for me and probably unfortunate for them. But they're being homeschooled, so they're slightly isolated from some of the reality. But I'm also not sure whether that's so good, because I think sometimes it's nicer to be more part of a community. So I don't quite know. But anyway, what I'm hoping to get out of these events, and I have today, thank you very much for your contribution, Jonica, I really appreciate it. I've got more ideas of how to creatively and constructively deal with our future and our comments and the responsibility of what we say and what we do.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, that's why one of the reasons I actually did want to see the faces to begin with, because I wanted to know what age group I was talking to. I mean, I pretty much told, you know, the story of the journey and so on, but you do adjust it depending on who's there a bit, because obviously at my age, I'm more likely to be feeling grief because I'm thinking that the world I grew up in, the snow, is not going to be that way in 20 years' time. Younger people, there might be some grief, but it's a different context because you weren't there in the 60s and 70s, you know. You don't know what the world was like there. You've got this beautiful world now. This is your now. This is your setting. So for younger people, anxiety and fear the eco-anxiety is a more dominant problem, and we do need to help overcome that and have strategies for it, because you know, one of the psychologists said to me, you have to remember the world's still a beautiful place. If anything, you know, Blanche and I have been talking about the fact that when you think about your heart places, you actually love them even more because you become aware of how much, you know, we get out of nature every single day. So live in the moment, enjoy, and just do what you can to create a good future. And there will still be an interesting future. You know, it'll be an exciting next 10, 20 years, let's face it, 10, 20, 30, 40, 50. I mean, there's going to be enormous change, and some of it will be negative and some of it will be fantastic. And we'll look back and go, oh, well, you know, look, all these amazing social changes that have happened that we didn't know were going to. So yeah, you do have to give the next generation hope and a sense of the future. But by the same token, I think sitting in denial that these things are happening isn't helpful, because in fact, let me just share an algorithm that one of the psychologists gave me, because I actually wrote a chapter called called anxiety, what was called worry. I didn't want to use it. Anxiety tends to be used as a medical term. So I called it worry, because it's fair enough to bloody worry about climate change. You know, that's a rational response to all this news. But how should parents deal with that with their kids? And they came up with this thing that I sort of put into an algorithm. So this might be for slightly younger kids, but it's actually true for all of us. So the first thing is name and validate the emotion. And I think for me, you know, naming and validating that there's such a thing called climate grief that I hadn't even heard of when I set out on this journey has been so ultimately calming once you sort of go through it, to actually understand it as grief and go, well, this is a normal, you know, and essential response. But it might be for kids fear, and then you get specific, you know, with young kids, for example, some of them actually think the world's going to end. They do. And so it's worth checking, like, what is your understanding? And I'm a science reporter. The world isn't going to end. It's going to get hotter and there'll be things that change that will change the way we live. But it's not like there's suddenly going to be a cutoff date. This is a life journey. So there is a positivity and a future there. So, you know, correct anything that's actually catastrophizing thoughts. Because I've heard some young people say, well, what's the point? Because we're all going to die of climate change in 30 years' time. And that kind of language, while it's important to motivate us to act on climate change, it can also be a bit counterproductive for young people, because you know, life will still go on, and there will still be beautiful world, but we just want to get the best of it that we can going into the future. So that's name and validate the emotions, but also correct any misunderstandings. Second thing is change what you can, and this comes to the action part, and we'll all be better or worse at this, but I think it's important not to blame people if they're not doing everything. Because the fact that if you're trying and actually actively trying to be a little bit better or do a little bit more each year, that's enough. That's your buckets. And then related to that, accept what you can't change. And I know we've really sort of touched on that all the way through. You can only bring yourself and what you do. And some people are going to be full-time activists. I know people who are full-time activists. I'm not. So I don't want to be judged for not being that any more than someone else wants to be judged because they want to go catch a plane and go on a holiday, you know. So we've got to be all a bit gracious and forgiving, that if we're all kind of trying to bring the whole society into this future. So yeah, just that little algorithm for dealing with people with eco-anxiety. It's, yeah, name and validate the emotion, change what we can and accept what we can't. I'm not sure, Kathy, if that answered your question. Do you have anything specific you want to follow up with that?
Well,
I can get a bit. What's that?
I'll be talking to my grandsons tomorrow via Skype.
How old?
They're 8 and 11.
Oh, they're young. Yeah.
Yeah, they're young. Yeah. And yeah, they live just out of Cleveland, Ohio. So at the end of October, the weather's changing, but and they're both aware of, well, not so much the younger one, but the older one is very aware of responsibilities and so on. And he, in fact, did, when he was at school, a real school, not just being homeschooled, he did try to start a class, an environmental club. And so he had to address the principal and ask him whether it was okay to do this and so on and so forth. And then he had to write a letter and, you know, all this sort of stuff. So he's very across all of this, but they are very aware of the fact that even at the moment, the weather's not sort of normal in where they are because it stayed warmer for much longer than usual. Yeah. But then again, I suppose we do know that we do have cycles. But when I went to visit them one time, and you'll love this one because you're a snow person, middle of winter, I hate winter, we could have walked from one side of Lake Erie, we could have walked to Canada.
It was all frozen.
Yeah. It was frozen. The lake, no, not really. Because, well, I don't know. It depends what you think. But yeah, the ice sheet was so frozen solid all the way through that we could have walked there. And that's very rare that it freezes.
Well, we are obviously getting more and more extreme weather things, and I could go into the science of that. But yeah, I mean, the thing is, we can not want it to happen all we like, but part of the journey of the book is me coming to terms with the fact that it is happening. And we've still got to go forward and live our lives. And how do we kind of go forward with that? Back to your youngsters, though, 8 and 11, because, yeah, it is really age specific where you are in all this kind of space. Like, you know, for the 20-year-olds who've done stuff as kids, a lot of them are really prone to burnout and despair in the 20s and early 30s. And then you've got the older group and, you know, the parents, and then they have this anxiety about their kids. And then the older still, you've got the grief. And then the young kids are just coming into their active phase. So one of the great things about the 8 and 10 is that, yeah, whatever they do will be good and will be helpful and will make them feel like they're doing something positive. And not only that, you know, when you hang out with the Climate Strike kids, you can see how much fun they have. I mean, this feeling of being alive at a time where what you do matters, it's actually, you know, there's actually a really lovely power in that, because we've been going a bit down the Instagram trivial side for decades. Life was very safe for several generations, and that's not necessarily good for creating good humans. And this sense that I see with joining the Climate Strike kids, and I don't know whether there are similar organisations that are as well developed in Ohio, but the kids all get not only a fantastic sense of camaraderie. I mean, I'm sure you've been on strikes and so on, most of you here, and, you know, they play music and dance, and, you know, we were doing Bohemian Rhapsody at one of the ones I went to. and they have a lot of fun. They have fun planning all the rallies. They have fun doing them, and yet there's this underlying sense of purpose and meaning that's really actually good for us. But the other thing, just from point of view of education, I see the education that people are getting from being part of the Climate Strike Kids. My Lord, I wish I'd was being taught all that when I was a kid. So this is over and above what they're getting in the school curriculum. How to organise together, how to talk to people that don't necessarily agree with you, how to research. I mean, the skills that these kids are getting that will be just so useful going into whatever careers they want to go into in future. I think there's so many positives in being part of these groups, particularly as a young person, in shaping your skill set, if you want to use that really dry term, which I don't particularly like, but yeah.
So thank you very much.
Thank you for attending.
Okay, I think any just last minute things, or are we going to have a last word from Jonica before we sign off here? Does anybody? Okay.
I was just having a quick Google for Kathy, and I can see on Facebook there's Ohio Youth for Climate Justice is something that just popped up. I couldn't find anything for School for Strikes for Climate on there, but that might be something, if you're on Facebook, Kathy, to have a look at Ohio.
Oh,
Youth
he's
for
on
Climate
that,
Justice.
Rosanna, but he knows about it, but his parents are even though they're both academics, they don't like the children using too much technology. So, but he does know about it. Yes.
Yeah, but maybe if you could look out for the meetings and things for him, maybe, and say, oh, there's a meeting on, so that then he can bypass the social media aspect and just turn up face to face to the meetings, maybe.
Yeah, that sounds great. And as I said, that those 3 kids that started that whole thing, those spider kids, they're still no good at social media,
Amazing. Well, thank you. Is anybody, I think we want to give fair, but it's nearly 10 to 4. How are you going there, Jonica?
Yeah, no, it's a pleasure. And I think, I said to Helen and to Blanche that when I wrote the book, and it's, it's my gift of active hope, you want to know what your contribution is. I thought, well, I could write something and use my skills to, help share things with other people. But, I haven't pursued the traditional career that I was in before that actually earned me money. I've wanted to go out and be talking about the ideas in this book. So it's a pleasure to me to have, anyone come along to a talk and just actually chat about these topics. So, yeah, of course I'll spend time doing it. It's why I wanted to go out and be talking about these ideas, is just to, if anything I've got to say or anything I've discovered is useful to others, I just want to share that, just as I get ideas from other people. So yeah, I'm happy to chat.
Can I just say, I think it's absolutely fantastic that Ramit Council is doing all these eco-living talks. I don't know about any other council that has done something like this, and I think I attended some from Ramit Council last year, and it's just so good. So thank you so much, and Jonica and all the speakers as well.
And I was remiss, I think, Eva and everybody, for not congratulating our fantastic sustainability staff. They are so fantastic. We are so lucky, and all our councillors, doesn't matter what our political persuasion, we are all hugely proud of the work that they do. So that's a real huge positive for us in our community. But yeah, our staff are unbelievable, and they relate really well to people within our community. So not only they are doing good things physically, they're doing lovely things emotionally as well. So yeah, we are so fortunate.
Thank you, Kathy.
Yeah, I know we're all just being nice to it. I mean, saying good things. Look, this is the whole point, you hang out with people who are doing the same things, and it does, speaking of Robin, someone put back, he was like, I've been outside for 2 hours, can I come in now? So he just wandered past. But yeah, doing things like this, it's fantastic. And you don't know who and what. This is all part of this big social tipping point too. You guys are doing, this is your inspiring vision. This is what you've created, this amazing eco-living festival. That's a fantastic, and all the other work that the council does, which I only know a fraction of. This is all moving everything forward. And yeah, it is easy to get sad when you don't see every leader quite getting it. But it's fantastic to be part of this. So yeah, congratulations, and thank you for inviting me. I would have loved to meet you all in person, but anyway, next best thing.
Coming soon.
Yeah. Thank
you everybody for hanging around with us and sharing the conversation. Thank you, Jonica, again for writing the book and then sharing your time today. It's been, I can't wait. Everyone's going to love reading the book, I'm sure. Yeah. There's so much in it. So
I found out
Christmas present.
Ready to hand my copy along to my family.
Yeah.
Christmas presents too, Blanche.
That's it.
Yeah. I was saying that, Jonica, I found out about your book through one of our colleagues in the sustainability transport team. And she said, I'm in the middle of reading this amazing book. And I said, okay. And I said, well, let's just get Jonica into the festival. Yeah.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. No, I really appreciate it. And, there just hasn't been anyone really talking about this space.
No.
So it's nice to get out there. And I've realized, my original instinct that I can't be the only one who wants to talk about this stuff was actually true. Like, there's so much talk about what we should do and, all the action part of it, and then the anger at what's going wrong. No one sort of helps us all talk about how do we process how we feel. Mm-hmm. And that's I guess what I found that I end up talking about. And the grief analogy really works, because you don't stay in grief. Grief is a funny one, because obviously you always will grieve a bit, what you're grieving. But you don't get stuck in that first early stage, you move through it. And most people, this is why the final chapter in the book is called Meaning. Did you know they've actually added a 6th stage of grief, and it's officially, and it's meaning? Because what happens after the grief, often you look for what is, yeah.
Oh, that is my reading list after reading that. You've got a great bibliography at the end, Lots of inspiration.
All right.
Okay. I'm going to have to go. How's everybody else?
Yeah, I think we'll go now. Thank you, everybody.